At 06:15 on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth crawled into the tail position of B-17 Tandleo at RAF Kimbolton, watching a gray English dawn that would carry him 500 miles into Germany. 24 years old with 12 combat missions completed and 3 confirmed kills to his name, Aruth knew the Luftwaffe had positioned over 300 fighters along the route to Kassel. And he settled onto the bicycle seat that served as his workstation in the tail gunner position, a cramped space measuring 4 feet wide and 5 feet long, with 2 Browning M250 caliber machine guns pointed backward through a plexiglass window. Temperature outside would drop to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at 25,000 feet, and his electrically heated suit stood as the only thing between survival and death by hypothermia. And the 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war because the tail gunner worked alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage with no one to talk to, no one to help if something went wrong, just a man, 2 guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe sent his way. Statistics told the story that everyone knew, but nobody wanted to discuss openly, and in the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. And tail gunners died faster than anyone, except ball turret gunners, because German fighter pilots preferred attacking from the rear, and the tail position absorbed the first bullets in almost every engagement. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations, which meant 90 men gone, and the numbers kept climbing because nobody had figured out how to stop the hemorrhaging. Problem came down to simple geometry that German pilots understood perfectly, and approaching from behind gave them the longest possible firing window because a Messerschmitt BF-109, closing at 350 miles per hour from the 6 o'clock position, had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. Tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target moving at combined speeds, approaching 600 miles per hour. Most tail gunners never got the chance to fire back effectively because the Focke-Wulf 190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, and a single burst could shred the plexiglass bubble, kill the gunner, and disable the tail controls before the American could react. And bombers without tail protection became easy targets because the fighters would circle back, line up, and finish the job methodically. Standard Army Air Force gunnery training taught gunners to wait, conserve ammunition, fire only at ranges under 300 yards, and the theory made sense in a classroom where instructors could draw diagrams and explain ballistics. But in combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting. By the time a tail gunner opened fire, he might already be dead. Aruth had watched it happen on his 6th mission when a B-17 flying off Tandleo's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section, and the gunner never fired a shot because the fighter came in fast with guns blazing, and the first rounds punched through the plexiglass before the American could react. Bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes emerged, and the tail gunner was not among them. Official doctrine demanded patience and fire discipline. But Aruth questioned everything about it because the fighters attacked from maximum range knowing American gunners would hold fire, and the Luftwaffe pilots had learned the patterns and exploited the training manual like a road map that showed them exactly when they were safe and when they were vulnerable. If you want to see how Aruth challenged the doctrine that was getting tail gunners killed, hit that like button. Back to Aruth. A-186 B-17's lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning, with 123 P-47 Thunderbolts escorting them partway. But fuel limitations meant the fighters would turn back over Belgium, and the bombers would fly the final 200 miles to Kassel alone. Aruth checked his ammunition belts, 400 rounds per gun, for 800 total, and the manual said that was enough for a standard mission. But Aruth had already decided the manual was wrong about everything else. By noon he would find out if he was right, and the cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral and a telegram to his family. Formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet still climbing, and Aruth watched the water recede through his plexiglass window with the white cliffs of Dover shrinking to a pale line on the horizon, and ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then the heart of Nazi Germany, where 300 fighters waited. P-47 escorts held position around the bomber stream, giving the illusion of safety. But Aruth knew the arithmetic because the Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying, and the mission to Kassel would take 6 hours, which meant for most of the journey the bombers would fly alone. Aruth had spent his first missions following doctrine exactly as trained. Wait for the fighter to close. You aim carefully, fire in short bursts, conserve ammunition, and training instructors at gunnery school had drilled it into every student that ammunition was limited and accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could make 800 rounds last an entire mission. Doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate, but the Luftwaffe did not cooperate, and German pilots had studied American tactics and knew the gunners waited until 300 yards. So they opened fire at 600 yards, pouring cannon shells into the bomber formations while the Americans held their triggers, and by the time the tail gunners started shooting, the damage was already done. Aruth had calculated the problem differently because a Focke-Wulf 190 at 600 yards was not a difficult target when it was flying straight toward him, with its nose pointed directly at his position, presenting the largest possible profile. And the closure rate meant the apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who started firing early could walk his tracers onto the target while adjusting aim as the range decreased. Risk sat in ammunition because 800 rounds sounded like a lot until you divided it by the number of attacking fighters, and a mission might see 15, 20, even 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the mathematics turned brutal. And a gunner who fired early might run dry before the mission ended. Aruth accepted the trade-off because a gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a poor bargain, and survival required disrupting the enemy's attack before it succeeded. If that meant running low on bullets, he would deal with that problem later, and dead men had no use for reserve ammunition. First test came on his fourth mission during a raid against submarine pens at St. Nazaire in June, when a pair of Bf-109s approached from the 6 o'clock low position in the classic tail attack, and standard doctrine said, wait. But Aruth opened fire at 700 yards. Tracers arced across the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter as Aruth adjusted his aim, and the German pilot saw the fire coming and broke off his attack, diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed, and neither fighter scored a hit on Tandleo. Crew chief questioned Aruth after landing because the ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 200 rounds on a single engagement, and at that rate he would run out before reaching targets deep inside Germany, and Aruth explained his reasoning, but the crew chief remained skeptical. Other tail gunners heard about the incident, and some called it reckless because wasting ammunition on long-range shots violated everything the Army Air Force taught. And the training manuals existed for reasons. Aruth was gambling with his crew's lives. But here's the thing. Tandleo kept coming home, mission after mission, with its crew intact, while other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not so fortunate. And by mid-July, 3 bombers from the squadron had gone down with 30 men lost. Crossing into Belgium on July 30th, Aruth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings and turn back toward England as fuel gauges in the Thunderbolts demanded retreat, and the bombers pressed on alone toward 300 German fighters waiting somewhere ahead. Aruth would need every round he had, and he would also need to survive long enough to use them. First, Messerschmitts appeared at 11:42, climbing from the southeast in groups of 4, and Aruth counted 8, then 12, and then stopped counting as the sky behind Tandleo filled with black crosses on yellow noses. Lead Fighter began its attack run from the 6 o'clock high position, diving toward the bomber formation at 400 miles per hour, and Aruth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each passing second. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. Twin Brownings roared to life, sending a stream of tracers across the sky, and the first rounds fell short, all disappearing into empty air below the diving fighter, but Aruth adjusted, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers began connecting, and bright flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine, cowling as the German pilot broke hard, right with smoke trailing from his aircraft. He never completed his firing pass, and the fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into the cloud layer below. Aruth had no time to watch because the second attacker was already closing from lower altitude, trying to slip beneath Aruth's field of fire, and the angle was difficult, requiring him to depress his guns nearly to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, sending a long burst toward the approaching fighter. Focke-Wulf pilot flinched, pulling up early and releasing his cannon shells into empty sky above Tandleo without scoring any hits. And attacks continued for 47 minutes as wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the bomber formation, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft, and Aruth fired at everything that came within range, burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red from sustained fire. At 12:29, ABF 109 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level, and the pilot had either extraordinary courage or poor judgment. Uhl and Aruth centered the fighter in his gun sight and held the triggers down for 6 continuous seconds, pouring over 100 rounds into the approaching aircraft. Messerschmitt disintegrated as the engine separated from the fuselage and the wings folded backward, and what remained of the fighter tumbled past Tandleo, close enough for Aruth to see the empty cockpit, where the pilot had either ejected or died at the controls. 2 confirmed kills and ammunition down to 180 rounds. Formation reached Kassel at 12:51 and began its bombing run, and for 11 minutes the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver, while the bombardiers lined up their targets. And the Luftwaffe knew this moment represented maximum vulnerability. Fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury. Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tandleo from the 5 o'clock position, and Aruth swung his guns to meet it, firing a short burst. And the rounds struck the fighter's wing root, but the pilot kept coming. Cannon shells tore through Tandleo's tail section. Aruth felt the impacts before he felt the pain as 20-millimeter fragments ripped through the plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and burying themselves in his left arm and shoulder, and his left gun jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment, but he kept firing with the right gun one-handed while bleeding. He tracked the wounded Focke-Wulf as it pulled away, and a final burst caught the fighter's tail assembly, and the aircraft snap-rolled and dove toward the ground. 3rd kill of the mission. Intercom crackled with voices from the crew, asking about damage and reporting flak ahead. And Aruth tried to respond, but his throat had gone dry. Blood pooled on the floor of his compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds expended, 63 remaining. 3 German fighters destroyed, and the mission was only half over, and Tandleo still had to fly 250 miles back to England through the same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed him on the way in. Aruth wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm and waited for the next attack. Return flight began at 13:04 as Tandleo turned westward with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a column of black smoke, and Aruth remained at his position scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass while the Luftwaffe regrouped. German fighters positioned themselves along the bomber stream's route to the English Channel, and fresh aircraft replaced those lost or damaged in the morning attacks, which meant the second gauntlet would be as dangerous as the first. Aruth's left arm had gone numb from the cold and the wounds, and his jammed gun remained inoperable. The feed mechanism shattered by the same cannon shell that had injured him, and he had 1 functioning weapon and 63 rounds of ammunition to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace. Mathematics demanded a different approach because at 63 rounds he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of 20 rounds each, and every trigger pull had to count. Luxury of suppressive fire was gone. At 13:31, a pair of BF 109s closed from the 7 o'clock position, and Aruth waited until 500 yards, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter, and the tracers struck the engine cowling. Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away trailing glycol coolant, and the wingman broke off without attacking. 51 rounds remaining. Tandleo crossed into France at 14:15, and the fighter attacks diminished as the Luftwaffe reached the limit of their operational range. And by 14:47, the bomber formation had outrun the last German interceptors. English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. Landing at Kimbolton came at 15:52, and Aruth could not climb out of his compartment without assistance, and ground crew pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him to a waiting ambulance where the flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds in his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Like the word spread through the 379th Bombardment Group within hours. The tail gunner on Tandleo had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with 63 rounds of ammunition. And the mission intelligence report noted his early engagement technique as a contributing factor to the bomber's survival. Other tail gunners began asking questions because standard doctrine said, wait until 300 yards. But Aruth had opened fire at 800. And the doctrine said, conserve ammunition, but Aruth had burned through 700 rounds before getting hit. Doctrine produced dead gunners, and Aruth was still alive. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer reviewed the combat footage from Tandleo's mission, and the gun camera showed Aruth's tracers reaching out far beyond normal engagement range, disrupting attack runs before the German pilots could establish firing solutions, and the early fire forced the enemy to maneuver. It is degrading their accuracy and reducing hits on the bomber. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron had adopted variations of Aruth's technique, and their survival rates improved, while the bombers they protected returned with less damage, and the correlation was difficult to ignore. The 379th Group Commander received a preliminary report on September 1st, stating that the data suggested aggressive early fire reduced bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated fighter attacks, and the implications challenged 2 years of established gunnery doctrine. Meanwhile, Aruth recovered from his wounds at the station hospital, where the fragment damage had missed major blood vessels and nerves, and the flight surgeon cleared him for duty on August 19th, 3 weeks after the Kassel mission. Tandleo had a new aircraft waiting because the old bomber had been written off after accumulating too much battle damage for economical repair. And the replacement carried the same name and the same crew. Aruth climbed back into the tail position on August 26th. Luftwaffe had noticed something changing in the American bomber formations, and their intelligence officers were studying the problem. Luftwaffe intelligence officers noticed the pattern in early September. American tail gunners were opening fire earlier, sometimes at ranges exceeding 600 yards. And the change disrupted attack formations that had worked reliably for months, and German fighter pilots reported the shift in debriefings across occupied Europe. Approach from 6 o'clock, once the safest angle against B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous because tracers reached out before pilots could establish stable firing platforms. And the psychological effect proved significant because a pilot watching tracers stream toward his aircraft at long range instinctively maneuvered even when the rounds were falling short. Luftwaffe's tactical response came in 3 phases. First, they increased approach speeds, diving on bomber formations at maximum velocity to reduce exposure time. Second, they shifted attack angles, approaching from the high 6 o'clock position where gravity would assist their pullout. And third, they began targeting specific aircraft that appeared to have aggressive gunners, hoping to eliminate the threat before it could spread. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem, because faster approaches meant less accurate shooting. Steeper angles increased the difficulty of tracking targets through the dive, and targeting aggressive gunners required identifying them in advance, which was nearly impossible in the chaos of a running air battle. The 379th Bombardment Group flew 11 missions between August 26th and September 5th, and Aruth participated in 4 of them, adding 2 more confirmed kills to his record, and other tail gunners in the group claimed an additional 7 kills. Luftwaffe's loss ratio against the Triangle K bombers was climbing. German fighter commanders tried concentrating their attacks, and instead of spreading interceptors across the entire bomber stream, they massed against single groups, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers, and the tactic produced results on September 3rd when concentrated attacks against the 100th Bombardment Group destroyed 8 aircraft in 15 minutes. The 379th escaped that slaughter by flying in a different position within the combat box, but the lesson was clear. The Luftwaffe was adapting, searching for weaknesses in the new defensive approach. Aruth understood the stakes because his technique worked because it surprised the enemy, and once the Germans developed effective responses, the advantage would disappear. Every mission was a test, every engagement a data point that both sides would analyze, and the temporary edge that aggressive fire provided was eroding with each passing week. Missions scheduled for September 6th would target Stuttgart deep in southern Germany, and the route would carry the bombers over 500 miles of enemy territory, the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month, and intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition from bases in France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Stuttgart manufactured ball bearings, components essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon in the German arsenal, and the strategic importance made it one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. All-and flak batteries ringed the city while fighter squadrons were positioned along every likely approach route. Briefing on September 5th laid out the challenge. The 379th would fly in the lead position of the combat wing, responsible for navigation and bomb, aiming for the formations following behind, and lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks, meant flying straight and level while other groups maneuvered, meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Aruth checked his guns that evening, and both Brownings were freshly serviced with the feed mechanism smooth, and the barrels replaced after accumulating too many rounds, and he loaded 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 800, because the extra ammunition added weight, but weight seemed less important than firepower. Tomorrow would test everything he had learned, and tomorrow would determine whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of his career. The Stuttgart mission launched at 0540 on September 6th, as 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky, forming up over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe, and Tandleo flew in the lead element of the 379th formation, positioned where Aruth would face the first attacks from any direction. Fighters found them over France at 0915 as Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields across the region, climbing to intercept the bomber stream before it reached German airspace, and the initial attacks came from the 11 o'clock position in head-on passes that tested the nose gunners rather than the tail. Aruth waited, watching contrails multiply behind the formation as the Luftwaffe built strength, assembling fighters from multiple units into a concentrated force, and by 0940 intelligence estimates counted over 100 interceptors tracking the bombers. Our rear attacks began at 10:08 when a staffel of 12 Bf-109s positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled up in a climbing attack from the 6 o'clock low, and Aruth opened fire at 700 yards, sending tracers into the lead element. 2 fighters broke off immediately while a third absorbed multiple hits and fell away smoking. Remaining 9 pressed their attack as cannon shells ripped through the formation, and striking bombers throughout the 379th Combat Box, and the B-17 flying off Tandleo's left wing took hits to its number 3 engine, while another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel from ruptured tanks. Aruth kept firing, shifting from target to target as fighters flashed through his field of view, and his ammunition counter dropped steadily. 600 rounds, 500, 400, and the attacks showed no sign of diminishing. And at 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tandleo from directly above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach, and Aruth spotted the fighter too late. 20mm shells punched through the tail section before he could bring his guns to bear. Impacts threw him against the plexiglass, and his left gun was destroyed, the receiver shattered by a direct hit, and fragments tore through his flight suit, opening wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood poured down his face, or partially blinding him. He kept firing with the right gun as the Focke-Wulf pulled up and rolled away trailing smoke from hits scored during its dive, and Aruth wiped blood from his eyes and searched for the next attacker. Tandleo was dying because the fighter's cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines, damaged the tail controls, and punctured fuel tanks in the wing roots, and the pilots fought to maintain altitude, but the bomber was losing the battle against gravity and aerodynamics. That formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04, and Tandleo held position long enough to release its bombs over the target, then fell out of formation as the damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate, and 2 engines were running rough while the fuel situation was critical. Pilots made the decision over eastern France. Tandleo could not reach England, and the best option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel where air-sea rescue units might reach them before hypothermia set in. Aruth remained at his position as the bomber descended, watching for fighters that might pursue the crippled aircraft. But none came because the Luftwaffe had other targets, healthier bombers still flying in formation. Tandleo hit the channel at 1512, impacting the gray water at 120 miles per hour. And the fuselage broke apart on impact. Aruth was thrown forward, his head striking the gun mount. Darkness. When he regained consciousness, he was floating in a life raft with British rescue boats approaching, and all 10 crew members had survived the ditching, but the bomber that had carried them through 17 missions lay at the bottom of the English Channel. Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived on October 14, 1943, and the second highest military decoration the United States Army could award, recognized Aruth's actions during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions, and the citation specifically mentioned his decision to continue firing while wounded, crediting his defensive fire with protecting the bomber during its most vulnerable moments. 8th Air Force's gunnery staff had completed their analysis by late October, and the data covered 14 bomber groups across 3 months of operations. And the conclusions challenged assumptions that had governed American air combat since 1942. Tail gunners who engaged targets beyond 500 yards showed measurably higher survival rates than those who followed standard doctrine, and the early fire disrupted enemy formations, forcing German pilots to maneuver defensively rather than establishing stable firing platforms, and the ammunition cost was significant, but the trade-off favored the aggressive approach. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command's operational planning, reviewed the findings personally, and the implications extended beyond individual aircraft, because if coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt mass fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine might require revision. Formal policy change came in November, when new gunnery guidelines authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. And the bureaucratic language was cautious, but the meaning was clear. The approach that had kept Aruth alive was becoming official doctrine. Aruth never saw the policy take full effect because his head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than initial assessments indicated, and after returning to flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers grounded him permanently. And recurring headaches and vision problems made continued combat duty impossible. Final tally stood at 17 confirmed kills, with 4 additional probables awaiting verification, and the number placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force, and some records credited him with as many as 19 victories, though documentation inconsistencies made precise counts difficult. Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross, and 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative combat achievements, and the Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds. By the time his combat career ended, Aruth had accumulated more decorations than most pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months, flying through the winter of 43, the invasion summer of 44, and the final campaigns of 45. And the tactics Aruth had pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command as tail gunners across the 8th Air Force adopted variations of early engagement doctrine. Statistical impact emerged gradually as bomber loss rates declined through 1944, though multiple factors contributed. Longer-range fighter escorts reduced exposure to unprotected combat, improved aircraft systems enhanced survivability, but defensive gunnery also played a role, and the shift toward aggressive fire was part of that improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change, and interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew mentioned the increased danger of tail attacks against American formations, and the easy kills that had characterized early bomber interceptions became progressively harder to achieve. Some pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks, accepting the higher closure rates in exchange for avoiding concentrated rear hemisphere fire. Aruth shipped home to the United States in early 1944, and the Army Air Forces assigned him to training duties, passing his combat experience to new gunners preparing for deployment overseas, and he spent the remainder of the war teaching others the techniques that had kept him alive. Students who passed through his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany, over Japan, over every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. What he did after the war surprised everyone who knew him, because Michael Aruth did not leave military service after the war ended, and he transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 and continued serving for another 15 years. Man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe chose to remain in uniform until 1962, retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant. Undecision puzzled some who knew his history, because Aruth had accumulated enough combat experience for several lifetimes, and he had been wounded twice, ditched in the English Channel, and faced death more times than official records could capture. Most veterans with similar experiences wanted nothing more than civilian life. Aruth saw it differently because the Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century, and the skills he developed had saved lives. Not just his own, but the crews who flew with him and the gunners who learned from his methods, and walking away felt like abandoning something important. Post-war years were quiet as he married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences, and the medals stayed in a drawer while the memories stayed locked away. Like many veterans of his generation, Aruth believed that those who had not been there could never truly understand. Elmer Bendiner, Tandleo's navigator, he took a different path and became a journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses, and the book described the crew's experiences in detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to history. Bendiner's account ensured that Tandleo and her crew would not be forgotten. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades after the war, as veterans gathered to remember friends who had not returned, not to share stories that their families had never heard, to honor the young men they had once been. And Aruth attended when his health permitted, reconnecting with survivors from those desperate months over Europe. National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received his remains on February 20th, 1990, and he had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine of Florida at the age of 70, and the headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. But it did not mention the 17 fighters he had destroyed, or the crews he had protected, or the doctrine he had helped reshape. Military cemeteries are full of such understatements because the stones mark names and dates but cannot capture the weight of what those names represent. And Aruth lies among thousands of other veterans, each with stories that deserve telling. Mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England, and the 379th Bombardment Group's records are archived there, including mission reports that document Aruth's combat achievements, and researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through documents that bear his influence. B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists, and the aircraft that carried men like Aruth into combat have mostly vanished, reduced to museum pieces and memorial displays. But the principles he demonstrated endure: the value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to challenge doctrine that was getting men killed, the courage to test new methods when old ones were failing. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button, because every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tail gunners who protected their crews with courage and innovation. Real people with real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world, and you are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Michael Aruth does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.